Introduction. People often get defensive and angry when challenged on the ambiguities underlying their arguments. This usually occurs when we identify a term that is used inconsistently within the proponent's dissertation. Naturally, we innocently ask the proponent to define this strategic term unambiguously and without circularities or contradictions. The proponent usually buckles under pressure. He will often hide behind the authority of the dictionary or a notable celebrity, an obvious fallacy. When his argument is about to be killed and with no other escape route in sight, he attempts to keep it alive with these contradictory claims. LOL, you are just arguing semantics. You are playing word games. I can't take you seriously. 2. There is no way of actually defining anything. It is self-contradictory, self-defeating, chaotic, self-serving literalism. 3. Ultimately, there is no way to actually define anything because every definition requires a reference to something else. Language is inherently circular. 4. Every word you wrote is key to the statement being made. Therefore, to be consistent, you must define all the words in your sentence, and all the words of those definitions, and so on, and so on. Words don't have and should not have any meaning whatsoever. We just open our mouths and talk whatever we want to mean on the fly. We have no problem understanding each other without definitions. 6. Words can have any number of meanings. I can reference multiple definitions for a word and use any of them willy-nilly in my presentation. 7. All definitions involve at least one observer, the person doing the defining. All definitions are subjective. 8. One should never get involved in questions of meaning and never get interested in words. If challenged by the question of what his terms really mean, he should say, I don't know and I'm not interested in meanings. One should never quarrel about words and never get involved in questions of terminology. One should always keep away from discussing concepts. Karl Popper. Sounds like these angry folks have a very delicate religion to protect. It's hard to imagine how the innocent inquiry of the fundamental unit of human comprehension, the word, can elicit such irrationality and venom from the supposedly intelligent human species. The word is mightier than the sword when it comes to destroying people's personal and political agendas. Isn't it fun watching these folks squirm when they don't even understand their own arguments? What's sweeter is how this article debunks each of their above arguments/complaints with military precision. Concepts facilitate comprehension. Our thoughts are concepts. Our brains utilize concepts for the purposes of cognition. Communication is an after-the-fact application of what we conceive. Cognition precedes communication, obviously, because the necessary precondition of communication is that we understand concepts before communicating them to others. As such, we use concepts to formulate words, grammar, and languages for communication. All words are lexical concepts. It is impossible to conceive of any concept without meaning. The instant any concept is conceived, so is its relational definition, whether one realizes it or not. An undefined word, concept, is an oxymoron and obviously impossible to conceive. A string of letters is not a word unless a meaning is ascribed to it. Therefore, all concepts have an unambiguous meaning in their proper context. It is inescapable, you cannot understand or communicate anything without first performing the following 3 steps. Conceiving of concepts. 2. Understanding their definition, or what they associate in their contextual ontology. 3. Understanding their application in the proper context. As the foregoing article explains, concepts are used in language to give meaning in the proper context. This is why linguistic grammars have 2 phases of resolution, the syntactical phase and the contextual phase. When precision is called for in our presentations, we must forego ordinary speech, metaphors, and ambiguities. Our goal is to define our key terms unambiguously to provide their intended meaning throughout the context of our presentation. This is what we call consistency. The proponent of an argument must ensure that his strategic terms, which underlie the basis of his argument, are used consistently throughout his whole presentation. This is how he can understand his argument well enough to communicate it to others. A definition is simply a description of the conceptual relations between the objects invoked within the specified context of a term. Definitions place limitations on the extent on the usage of the terms in question for the purposes of avoiding ambiguities, circularities, and contradictions. Only then can the terms have consistent meaning in one's dissertation. A definition has nothing to do with explanations, causes, experiments, evidence, truth, proof, knowledge, or other relevancies. A definition is merely a description that gives meaning to a lexical concept, i.e. word. All concepts describe the relations between the objects they invoke, and this is their intrinsic meaning. As such, all concepts are necessarily defined, whether we like it or not. Is the dictionary the ultimate authority on definitions? It is perfectly sufficient to consult the dictionary for common terms of ordinary speech. For the crucial terms underlying a critical presentation in science, medicine, engineering, etc., the dictionary often becomes useless due to its ambiguities, circularities, and contradictions. Dictionaries were written by English graduate students to offer general-purpose guidelines so the reader can infer the meaning of a term. As such, the dictionary can only be used as a guide. That's why we often look up terms across several dictionaries to gauge various perspectives before we settle on a definition. Obviously, dictionary authors didn't take the extra effort to conceptualize word ontology without circularities, ambiguities, and contradictions. Hence the reason why there are hundreds of dictionaries with varying, and in many cases, contradictory definitions. What a mess. Definitions are entered into dictionaries without consideration of their scientific consistency, only by their popular usage. That makes dictionaries subject to the fallacies of arguments by populism and authority. Those who refer to a dictionary to defend their crucial terms are committing these fallacies as well. Dictionaries also commit the fallacy of figure of speech, the confusion between the metaphorical or figurative use of a word and the literal use of a word. Those who view the dictionary as an authority should look up words like truth and knowledge and settle the 5,000 years long-standing debate in philosophy. What happens when you open another dictionary that uses a different definition? Does that contradict the previous dictionary? Who decides which dictionary contradicts which? Should we ask the President of the United States or even the Pope to decide? Should the decision come from a levitating guru, the oracle at Delphi, a crystal ball, Ouija board, God, a coin flip, or should we go to the polls and vote on the issue? There are no authorities. An intelligent person will not partake in such subjective rituals to define the crucial terms of his presentation. For example, a scientist is responsible enough to define his key terms objectively in order to convey his meaning as clearly as possible. He refines his definitions well enough to objectively apply them within his discipline. If we can contradict a term within his presentation, then he obviously didn't put enough effort into defining the terms of his hypothesis. A scientist never extrapolates the dictionary definitions of ordinary speech into his scientific context. Otherwise, a rigorous definition of these terms can instantly destroy his entire argument. Objectivity and consistency are the hallmarks of the scientific method. How do we define words? Let's assume that a member of the audience has identified ambiguities or contradictions in one of our terms. Since our whole argument hinges on this crucial term, it suddenly comes to a halt. How do we go about refining the crucial term in order to resurrect our broken argument? Q. Without a dictionary, how can we define our key terms objectively? Answer: the only solution is to use our critical thinking skills to reason out the relations which parsimoniously capture the precise meaning of our term. Since all terms are concepts, they necessarily establish relations between objects. Hence, we A. Begin by first identifying all the objects utilized by the term in its proper context. B. Establish the contextual relations between the objects, thus giving our term its precise meaning. The rest is just a linguistic exercise of forming a coherent and unambiguous statement for our definition. As an example, let's define the term surfing. A. What are the objects utilized by the term? A person, surfboard, and a body of water. B. What are the contextual relations between the objects? The person riding on the surfboard. The surfboard slides on the surface of the water. The surface of the water is waving transversely. Definition of surfing: the act of riding a surfboard that slides on the surface of the forward crest face of the waving water. Definition is unambiguous, precise, and can be used consistently. Our rational response to the intellectual cowards. The following complaints are consistently launched by self-proclaimed intellectuals who give themselves fancy titles such as atheist, secularist, non-theist, freethinker, bright, rationalist, skeptic, objectivist, among others. LOL, you are just arguing semantics. You are playing word games. I can't take you seriously. This popular jingle is sung by charlatans who attempt to turn the tables on those who question their terms, the very semantics they use to push forward their arguments. Semantics is a branch of linguistics which studies the meaning of terms. So it goes without saying that all words are semantical because they must be defined unambiguously before they can convey any meaning whatsoever. Otherwise, users of ambiguous terms commit the fallacy of equivocation, aka semantic shift. Conveniently equivocated a key term in his presentation with various meanings. This allows him to cover all his bases and protect his contradictory argument from attack by employing multiple semantic shifts to systematically move the goalposts on his opponents. And as long as nobody notices and challenges his use of equivocation, his contradictory argument is kept alive and accepted by the audience. So yes, indeed, the proponent is forcing you to swallow an argument built on ambiguous semantics. But when a member of the audience exposes the semantic wordplay, the proponent retaliates with a strawman attack to silence him. This lame tactic involves turning the table on your opponent by redirecting the issue of semantics right back to him. Bottom line is this: you cannot build your presentation out of wordplay and then turn around and tell anyone who exposes that wordplay that they are arguing semantics, when in fact, it is you who has been arguing semantics all along. LOL, poof goes their complaint. 2. There is no way of actually unambiguously defining anything. It is self-contradictory, self-defeating, chaotic, self-serving literalism. Is this infantile statement worthy of discussion? I mean, Quinn, who is this charlatan fooling by explicitly using words with unambiguous meanings to convey his unambiguous, meaningful opposition to rail against words having unambiguous meanings? Did anybody spot his circular argument? If all words in the language are indeed ambiguous, then obviously the boneheads above statement is ambiguous and meaningless. What could those words possibly mean? What is this clown trying to tell us? Not so clever charlatans make use of their unambiguously defined words to buttress their so-called opposition to unambiguously defined words. Isn't that ironic? They outright ignore their own contradictions, a common deceptive tactic from those with an agenda to protect. But he is correct about his self-serving literalism, as only the words comprising his statements are unambiguous, while yours are always ambiguous. LOL, poof goes his argument. Ultimately, there is no way to actually define anything because every definition requires a reference to something else. Definitions and languages are inherently circular. Looks like somebody doesn't understand what a circular definition is. Perhaps a definition is in order, huh? A circular definition is either a synonym or a statement which invokes the very word you are trying to define. All words are concepts. As such, their definitions are reducible to relations involving two or more objects. All words are relations, it's unavoidable. Anything you can conceive of is necessary for relation to something else. A definition can reference anything it desires as long as it conveys an unambiguous meaning. Only if it references the very term it defines can it be considered circular. Linguistics 101. Relational with circular. This leads them to unwittingly assert that the only way to eliminate circularity from our definitions is by not relating objects within our terms. But they instantly contradict themselves because all words are lexical concepts and thus necessarily relational. Such proponents need to take an entry-level course in linguistics so they can stop chasing their tails in circles. It's obvious that our expert Bellyaker is insisting that language is inherently circular because he says so. And he hopes you don't question him. Not so fast. Textual languages are not circular because they aren't inherently tautological. Language is not employed with just mere logical syntax. Language has two phases of grammar, syntactical and contextual. The contextual phase gives meaning to terms and always overrides any implicit circularity allowed by syntax alone. That is, you cannot use a linguistic term as a placeholder to syntactically plug in its expanded definition and expect to retain the proper contextual meaning of the sentence in question. Language is not inherently tautological akin to mathematics and systems of logic. So you can't treat linguistic terms like math variables, plug in results, and still retain their original contextual meaning. It takes either a charlatan or an ignorant fool who doesn't understand the difference between linguistics and tautologies to posit such an assumption, and hence push the reductio ad absurdum fallacy on his opponent. Textual languages define their terms by relating objects. Objects are never circular and neither are any unambiguously defined terms. There is no circularity between a car and the road, nor is there a circularity in any defining concept relating to those objects. Anybody who thinks that languages are inherently circular should have no problem showing a circularity in the following simple sentence: the ball is on the table. How about it? If you can't show it, then you're just a chronic Bellyaker who likes to hear himself whine in front of the mirror. A common ailment within the human species. Against definitions is a fine example of a pathetic individual who unwittingly underscores the importance of definitions. Isn't that ironic? The proponent of this claim needs to understand that contextual languages like English are not tautological, like math and logic, which are inherently circular. So you really can't apply the circular logic jingle to our contextual languages of communication. Poof goes his argument. Every word you wrote is key to the statement being made. Therefore, to be consistent, you must define all the words in your sentence, and all the words of those definitions, and so on, and so on. This grievance is actually very popular among the so-called atheists, secularists, freethinkers, and objectivists out there. They usually utter it when a physicist provides them with an unambiguous definition for object and exist. Since the definitions of these key terms of physics reduce their atheistic worldview to a subjective discipline, they complain that they don't understand the definition and request you to recursively define all the words in your sentence ad infinitum. The opponent of this argument is trying to fool you into accepting the old sophist reductio ad absurdum fallacy, an attempt to refute you by changing the reasoning of your argument to extend it to a point of absurdity or contradiction. He is desperately trying to reduce human language, the basis of communication, to absurdity by asserting circular strawman attacks against all words and their meaning. But of course, he is using none other than words with meaning to accomplish this, lol. The proponent attempts to degrade language as circularly meaningless for the purposes of showing just how ridiculous the consequences would be with recursive definitions. He is proposing that we can't define any word without entering into some kind of circularity, since we are under his obligation to recursively define all the words we use in our definition as well. It obviously takes a dishonest fool to launch such a contradictory attack on his opponent's argument. But can you blame him? I mean, he has exhausted all his options and this trick is his last resort to declare himself as a winner. How language works. We don't recursively define all the words in a definition when we look up terms in the dictionary. Defining one or two troublesome terms usually suffices. When was the last time you used the dictionary to look up all the words in a dictionary recursively forever and ever? That's right, nobody does this. Yet we still understand terms in the language without ambiguities and circularities. And that's because language is not circular, as explained in grievance number 2. Let's put this pathetic circus act within the proper context of their extreme devil's advocate position. We kindly accept their proposal and proceed to test whether their argument is valid or contradictory. Naturally, we in turn complain that we didn't fully understand their proposal, and kindly ask them to recursively define all the terms they uttered ad infinitum, just as they propose. I mean, this is their argument, right? So we are being fair to them, right? So without further delay, they can use whatever dictionary or source they like. If the proponent of recursive definitions can't accomplish his own task, then obviously his proposal, that we must recursively define all terms, is contradictory. Poof goes his argument right before his very eyes. Gee, it was quite easy for him to put his own foot in his mouth, huh? Seriously, when someone asks us to define non-key terms, especially recursively, it's an attempt to take the discussion along an irrelevant tangent for fear of getting his ass whipped. We only define the key terms in our arguments. For the rest of the non-critical terms, regular ordinary speech/dictionary definitions will suffice. Science is only about unambiguously defining the critical terms of one's dissertation. In the case of physics, those crucial terms are usually object and exist. Consistency refers to the singular contextual usage of the term throughout one's presentation, and not the contradictory notion of recursively defining all the words of every sentence ad infinitum, reductio ad absurdum fallacy. When the extreme devil's advocate gets called out to test his own contradictory proposal, it becomes a very embarrassing and painful experience for him, one that requires him to keep a vomit bag nearby. And should not have any meaning whatsoever. We just open our mouths and talk whatever we want to mean on the fly. We have no problem understanding each other without definitions. Considering the above statement, one begins to wonder, is this how education works? You never talk to your kids, never teach them any words or meanings. Schools never teach words, definitions from dictionaries, grammar, or even language. Then how did anyone learn to read, understand the meanings of words and communicate ideas? With your first paycheck in that new job, why didn't you interpret $70,000 annual salary to mean getting paid $70,000 every 30 days? Once your boss tells you that annual is defined as every 365 days, why don't you just give him the statement above and win the argument? Would that line actually work in the real world or only in internet discussion groups? Clearly, words do in fact have specified meanings. Proof goes his argument. 6 words can have any number of meanings. I can reference multiple definitions for a word and use any of them willy-nilly in my presentation. Opponent of this claim is praying to God that you aren't aware of the fallacy of equivocation. A person is said to equivocate in his argument when he invokes multiple meanings for a single term. He is purposely trying to make his argument ambiguous so that you won't notice its literal failures and contradictions. Ambiguities and dualities present an aura of confusion over the audience. And the charlatan is counting on this because most people are too embarrassed to ask questions for fear of looking stupid. If they are confused or don't understand something, it must be because the presenter of the argument is much smarter than them, right? Equivocations in arguments are most often used to elicit an argument from authority, a fallacy, in order to beat your subordinates into submission. This usually gives the impression that the charlatan's argument is rock solid and must be swallowed without question. Defining God to be a million things, energy, incorporeal, timeless, all of existence, outside of space and time, absolute, etc., just to confuse the hell out of you so you can't refute his argument. Clearly, in any argument, terms can only have one precise meaning throughout the proponent's dissertation. Not only does this ensure consistency, but it also shows that the presenter understands what he is talking about. Do we need to say anything more about this obvious fallacy? Proof goes his argument. Involve at least one observer, the person doing the defining. All definitions are subjective. The proponent of this complaint wants to give the illusion that your objective definition is actually just as subjective as his for the same term. But the fact of the matter is that a person conceiving of a definition is not equivalent to an observer included as a requirement within the definition itself. An objective definition is one which has no observer invoked within itself, i.e. it is observer independent. A presenter must define the terms that make or break his theory, but that's a far cry from confusing himself for an actor within his definition. Object as that which has shape. The shape is what an object has before I approach it. Whether you agree with the definition is immaterial to the question we have before us, which is whether all definitions invoke an observer. The definition of object is an example of an objective, i.e. observer independent definition. Hence, not all definitions are subjective. Opponents of this complaint obviously haven't brainstormed their definitions well enough to eliminate observer subjectivity. Their definitions unwittingly bring eyewitness testimony/opinion into their dissertation and expose their blatant contradictions. This is what is done in religion. They invoke observer opinion within all their definitions, hypotheses, and theories for the purposes of using emotional arguments to persuade the audience to swallow their rhetoric. Science will have none of that. Here's an exchange between a scientist and a theologian elucidating the downfall of observer-dependent definitions. Scientist, is God an object? Theologian, he is to me. Scientist, why? Theologian, because I saw and touched him last night. Scientist, are you telling me that an object is that which you can see/touch? So God wasn't an object before you even saw/touched him. God didn't even exist before you laid your eyes on the Almighty. Theologian, sorry, gotta run. I think I left something on the stove. Definition is objective only when it doesn't invoke an observer within it. Proof goes his argument. 8. One should never get involved in questions of meaning, and never get interested in words. If challenged by the question of what his terms really mean, he should say, I don't know and I'm not interested in meanings. One should never quarrel about words, and never get involved in questions of terminology. One should always keep away from discussing concepts. Karl Popper. This gem comes from a popular individual who understands that definitions are what makes or breaks a person's argument. But in his case, all his arguments are destroyed in one fell swoop by a simple definition. This is why he cowers in fear. The written word is indeed mightier than the sword, even a lightsaber. Intellectual cowards like Karl Popper are a dime a million. This individual is no different than the clowns we've already addressed above. Deception has no place in science. Those who are too embarrassed by their arguments and the consequences of defining their terms need to find another job to keep themselves busy, perhaps as a dress rehearsal coordinator or a residential sanitation consultant. It's ironic how the so-called atheists, secularists, non-theists, freethinkers, brights, rationalists, skeptics, and objectivists out there will pester the theist to provide an unambiguous and non-contradictory definition for God, while they self-serving turn the other cheek and rail against such definitions when their own religion is threatened. They even swallow their own foot by rejecting every single dictionary definition of God. These folks are the epitome of intellectual cowardice. Painful lesson to be learned by the intellectual cowards we've addressed above. Your argument or complaint has to be good enough for you before you attempt to apply it to someone else. You can complain that my unambiguous definitions are an opinion or a circular until the cows come home. You don't fool anyone. This article has contradicted your petty complaints. Those who cannot define, just whine. To destroy any objection one has against an unambiguous and non-contradictory scientific definition. The intellectual cowards addressed above are only bellyaching because they lack the capacity to think critically and formulate non-contradictory definitions. That's why they've made fools of themselves in public. There's no excuse for one's inability to define the key terms of their dissertation in no ambiguous terms. Those who vehemently rail against objective definitions are intellectual cowards that refuse to participate ethically in intellectual discussions of reason and honesty. Their arguments are founded upon loopholes and dualities, so it's no wonder they will do anything to avoid defining their terms and misdirect the audience away from their contradictions. The proponent should be prepared to answer questions pertaining to the definition of his key terms. He is expected to tell the audience exactly what he means. There should be no colloquialisms, ambiguities, reification, euphemisms, hyperboles, metaphors, poetry, allegories, parables, similes, conjuring up imagery, etc. These loose figures of speech have no place in critically reasoned intellectual presentations. Always be those who oppose clear language and rationality. They are content with reducing human ingenuity and understanding back into the dark ages. These proponents are just bellyaching with no basis or justification other than their own baneful agenda. At the end of the day, they don't really fool anybody. Their petty archaic tactics are over 2,500 years old, since the days of the sophists. Conclusion. The concept is the fundamental unit of human comprehension and communication. As such, all concepts are defined to have a specific meaning. Concepts are the linguistic tools we use in science to not only describe relationships between objects in reality, but to utilize these relationships to explain the physical mechanisms of phenomena such as light, gravity, magnetism, and electricity. Ambiguous and contradictory terms have no place in science. For example, one cannot claim to be doing physics unless they can define the terms object and exist. If you claim to be studying reality, i.e. existence, then you should be able to tell the audience exactly what you are studying without any double talk. Otherwise, you are no different than a religionist who reifies concepts and pretends to treat them as real entities. Crucial terms which make or break his argument, he has no excuse for his shortcomings. This article will forever be a thorn in his side.